But wait, doesn't this contrast with what we just learned from the study by Kwok and her colleagues? I mean, Kwok used a made-up language, and it doesn't get any more arbitrary than that, right? The 3D framework offers a resolution. The research on infants by Skelton and her colleagues gives us insights into the evolutionary mechanisms of color vision. These foundations are ancient, so much older than language. This suggests that the brain's architectural and computational constraints for vision were the impetus to the world's color vocabularies in the first place. In other words, because our eyes naturally differentiate certain colors, our language systems evolved to name them. Now let's link this to the language training study done by Kwok and her colleagues. In combination with these basic evolutionary fault lines for color differentiation, experience with language overdevelopment often accentuates these breaks, but sometimes it can alter them. And that's exactly what we saw with the variation of color terms across Herero, Russian, and English speakers. By now, the story should be familiar. There are always multiple mechanisms at play. Evolution gives humans a genetic head start in color processing. These combine with the brain's inherent plasticity, which allows social mechanisms over development to either deepen those pathways or forge new ones based on unique experience. This hybrid way of thinking about linguistic relativity is gaining more and more support from cognitive scientists. One compelling account has come from my grad school professor, Terry Regier, who's now at UC Berkeley. In 2017, Regier proposed a helpful way of reconciling how universal foundations for cognition, like innate color biases, can coexist with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Regier's solution was to cast linguistic relativity as a type of Bayesian probabilistic inference, which in lay terms basically means an educated guess. The idea is that when we are sure of something, we don't need the help of language. But as uncertainty grows, so does our reliance on linguistic categorization. Regier uses color as an example. Suppose I gave you a paint chip that was green, but not a perfect green. There was a noticeable tint of blue to it. Next, suppose that I held up two more paint chips, one the exact same color as the one you're holding, and the other a more traditional shade of green, what most English speakers would call pure green. Under these circumstances, if I asked you to choose the chip that was closest to the one you were holding, which one would you pick? This isn't a trick question. Clearly, you'd pick the correct one, the bluish-green one. But consider this scenario. What if instead of holding the original color in your hand, you had to recall it from memory? Let's say 5 minutes later. If I held both colors up again, which one would you pick in this case? Regier would say that the odds have now shifted a bit and that you'd be more likely to make a mistake. You'd sometimes pick the pure green one, not the blended one. What if instead of 5 minutes later, it was a day later? Regier would expect even more bias towards the pure green one. And how about a week later? Well, I think you get the picture. So what's going on here? The idea is this. As the actual perception of the color gets further away, it becomes fuzzier and fuzzier in your memory. As this happens, you increasingly fall back on linguistic color categories to help you. Because the original color was much more green than blue, you think to yourself, I know it was green, but I just don't know what shade. According to Regier, the activation of the linguistic category of green becomes a cue in your memory that nudges you towards picking the one that most people would say is pure green. Regier has a catchy name for this mental process. He calls it the cognitive control knob. When basic perceptual information is sufficient, like when you can actually see the original color, you don't need to turn the knob. But as perceptual certainty goes down, you turn up your language to give you an extra boost. By the way, Regier's idea has an added attraction. Not only can it reconcile evolutionary mechanisms with developmental ones, it also helps to explain why linguistic relativity is so fickle in scientific experiments. Not all Whorfian effects are reliable, and Regier's cognitive control knob offers a reason why. Perhaps the effects of language kick in only when uncertainty is high in an experiment, but when perceptual certainty is crystal clear, There's no need to turn up the language knob for help. Let's finish up by viewing this cognitive control knob from an even broader perspective. Regeer's idea is a classic domain general approach to understanding the mind. At its core, the mechanism is basically a Bayesian probability analysis. When you're uncertain of something, how do you weigh different information or cues to constrain your decision? This is an extremely general process. It applies not just to language cues, but all possible constraints on decision making. For example, connecting back to McWhorter, why can't we think of culture as a constraint too? In fact, this is exactly how my colleague down at Cornell, Daniel Casasanto, views it. Casasanto likes to relate linguistic relativity to what he calls cultural relativity. What he means by cultural relativity is something similar to Worf's linguistic relativity. In Casasanto's words, certain aspects of people's thinking vary relative to the cultural practices they engage in. And one of his favorite examples, he talks about metaphors for space being used to conceptualize the passage of time and how different cultural practices lead to different metaphors. First, he sets this up by pointing out that people across all cultures use spatial metaphors to talk about time. For example, in English, the past is behind us and the future is in front of us. These metaphors are so natural that they make great fodder for marketing and political campaigns. Consider Joe Biden's 2020 slogan for US president. Our best days still lie ahead. Actually, there's a couple of metaphors in there. Where do these spatial metaphors come from? Going back to a paper from 1973, the Stanford linguist Herb Clark hypothesized that it's the result of the way the human body naturally moves through space. Because our heads, hands, and feet are biologically pointed to the front, that means that most of the time we move forward through space. And because it takes time to travel through space, we unconsciously learn to map the future to what's ahead of us and the past to where we came from. Makes sense, right? Now, why humans are inclined to think metaphorically in the first place is a separate and fascinating question, and we'll talk about that in the final lecture. Casasanto makes an interesting observation. The sagittal axis, front and behind, is nearly universal for spatial metaphors for time, but no known language has ever verbally referred to time on the lateral axes, left and right. So in English, you'd expect to hear Monday comes before Tuesday, but not Monday is to the left of Tuesday. Now, even though we don't explicitly say such things, what's interesting is that speakers of English implicitly think like that. I'm going to tell you about a seminal experiment that demonstrated this, and I want you to try to explain the pattern of results on your own. Back in 1991, the Stanford cognitive scientist Barbara Tversky had over 1,000 English-speaking and Arabic-speaking children and adults place stickers labeled breakfast and dinner relative to a sticker named lunch on the middle of a table. Here's what she found. The English-speaking subjects were much more likely to place the breakfast sticker to the left of lunch and the dinner sticker to the right of it. The Arabic speakers did the opposite. Breakfast was placed to the right and dinner was placed to the left. Can you think of an explanation for this? I'll give you a hint. Hebrew speakers arrange things like Arabic speakers, not like English speakers. What's culturally common between Arabic and Hebrew? They both are read and written from right to left, not left to right like English. So it appears that the cultural convention of reading and writing has caused the two groups to conceive of the arrow of time differently. By the way, this can also be seen in the hand gestures that accompany speech. To refer to the past, Americans gesture to the left, but Arabic speakers gesture to the right. But a problem remains. Correlation does not equal causation. How can we know for sure that the cultural convention of reading and writing is actually causing all these interesting patterns? To pin down causality, Casasanto and his colleague Roberto Bottini devised a clever little experiment with Dutch speakers. Like English, the Dutch read and write from left to right. In the experiment, subjects were asked to read phrases that had a common spatial metaphor for time, like a year earlier. The task was to press a red button if the phrase was about the future and a blue button if it was about the past. Now here's the key manipulation. The red button was situated on the right side of the screen and the blue button was situated on the left. There were also trials that counterbalanced the colors to rule out color as a cause. Importantly, the experimenters never mentioned the location of the buttons, only the colors. This was to ensure that subjects didn't figure out that the location of the buttons were relevant to the experiment. The main finding was that subjects were faster to press the buttons when they spatially matched the flow of time. So when they read a year earlier, they would press the button when it was on the left faster than when it was on the right. This was flipped with sentences about the future, like a year later. Now here's the most interesting thing. Some subjects were asked to read sentences that were mirror reversed, which meant that they had to go from right to left, not left to right. This is initially hard to do, but really with just a little bit of practice, people can learn to do this very easily. What's remarkable is that even after just 5 minutes of this practice, the spatial effects completely reversed. Now people were fastest when pressing the left button for the future and the right button for the past. This is a nice example of the usefulness of the experimental approach. Because the same subject showed two different patterns, we can rule out that language or other cultural factors were at play. Those things were held constant, and the only thing that differed across conditions was the reading direction. Maybe you're not convinced that reading direction is a meaningful cultural convention, so let's finish up with a much more canonical one. I want to share a classic study done back in 2001 by Takahiko Masuda of the University of Alberta and Richard Nisbet of the University of Michigan. They explored a well-known cultural difference between Japanese and American people. Japanese culture focuses more on how individuals collectively fit into a social context, whereas American culture focuses more on individual autonomy. Might these different cultural values shape basic cognitive processes of the mind? The experiment asked participants from both countries to watch a short video of an aquarium scene. In the foreground, there was a large central